Well, hi. Welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is entitled Meaningful Causation. This will be the first of two-part series of lectures talking about the final element of causation that we need to consider, trying to put together a lot of what we've learned in previous classes. But ultimately, what I want to walk away with from today's lecture is an understanding that even if we know that cause exists, the cause relationship that we're looking at, the particular stimulus and the particular effect in question, may be one that's kind of so small in scope anyway, even if we know it exists, that's not worth spending a lot of time talking about. That's the basic take-home point from today's lecture. All right, let's start out. The Parcheesi gene, front page New York Times, February 2005. Said the EMBA, the European Molecular Biology Association, researchers have reported yesterday at a neuroscience conference in Brussels that they have identified a gene prevalent among Liechtensteinians, people from Liechtenstein, associated with a significant advantage over Tajikistanis in playing the ancient Indian board game Parcheesi. How people get paid to do this is beyond me, but apparently there's enough money rolling around at the EMBA that they came up and did this very important study about Parcheesi. I wasn't sure whether this was a spoof article in the New York Times or not, but they researched this and found a genetic association that allowed for Liechtensteinians to have a significant advantage, according to their genes, as constituted in comparison to those of Tajiks. And this is, of course, a huge affront to Tajiks who, being in the Indian region, are prized Parcheesi players. Okay, now that we've got those facts straight, here's the question to you. Do we care about this Parcheesi gene? Is this Parcheesi gene important for us to know about? Here's Liechtenstein, next to Austria and Switzerland, and then the home team, Tajikistan, next to China, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, prized homeland of Parcheesi players. So let me ask you something. Knowing nothing more about the study than what you've just seen, what else do you want to know before you talk about this study with your friends and announce this to the public that, oh my goodness, they've found the Parcheesi gene? In other words, what else do you want to know before you eliminate scholarships for Parcheesi playing college students of Tajik descent and award them to Liechtensteinians instead, on the genetically preferred basis that has been conferred by the MBA? Do we need to evaluate the efficacy of the study? Do we want to know how causation was established? Of course. Was this an observational study? Most likely. Was this a study that potentially had some confounders? Yeah, probably. And we can think of any number of confounders, countless confounders that could come into play besides genetics with why Liechtensteinians might be more associated to perform better on a Parcheesi game than those of Tajik descent. There's potential bias in the measurement here. We'd have to know how they measured it. And there's also, of course, chance in the study that can't be ruled out. So all the same things that come back that we were concerned about with observational studies and concerns about confounders, bias, and chance, they're all going to come back and play a role here before we would actually accept that the genes are causing a difference in Parcheesi playing ability. But even beyond that, there's sort of a who cares in this. How meaningful, how big a difference in playing ability is there on the basis of genetics between these two different races? And that's really what we want to talk about today. How important, how meaningful is the causal relationship, even assuming that we know it exists? So I want to give you a second example. The tidal effects of the moon's gravity. Okay, here's the moon. Moon goes around the Earth, and the moon affects, through its own gravitational forces, forces on Earth, including the tides. And so tides come in and go out, due to relative location of the moon to the Earth at any given time, and therefore can affect the flow of water in the oceans. Here's my question to you. What if somebody is pushed off a roof at a certain time of day where the moon is either closer or farther away? Does the position of the moon relative to the Earth influence the velocity at which the person falls off a roof? And is that meaningful? So the answer is yes. At some level, the moon's gravity is affecting somebody's velocity just as the moon's gravity affects tides, right? And so there is some effect here. However, the major point to bring up is that just because there's some effect doesn't mean it's a meaningful effect. And here we have three different curves I've drawn out, and the red is obscuring the title here a little bit, but the title says collision velocity after falling from a rooftop given the time of day and the distance of the moon to the earth at that given time. So the red line is 12 p.m., the medium blue line is 4 p.m., and the aqua blue line is midnight. Okay? And so this is different times of day where the moon is relative to the earth. The horizontal axis is the building's height that someone's falling off of, and then the collision velocity in meters per second is the speed with which somebody hits the ground as they come off the roof. And there'll be some sort of curve for this, right? That the velocity accelerates as there's a higher and higher building that someone's pushed off of. But notice the point here. These curves are almost on top of each other. And the reason for that is the moon's effect, even though there is one, on the effect of someone's velocity falling off a building is so small in actual magnitude that it's almost immeasurable. In other words, let's say that building height predicts for 95% of the collision velocity of the average person falling off of a roof. Then, and let's say, besides the height of the building, things like air friction might come into play to what the person's wearing or the weight of the person and so forth. All factors that might account for velocity of the collision for the person falling off the roof. So if building height predicts for 95% of that, then if we were to say, well, we need to take into account the moon's gravitational force in accounting for the velocity, instead of 95% accounting for the speed at which someone collides with the ground, we are now talking about being able to account, if we take into effect the moon's effect on this, about 95.01%, right? There's very little effect on velocity the moon is going to have on the collision velocity. So if changes in a known cause, like the position of the moon relative to the Earth, do not explain much of the variation in an outcome, collision velocity, then it's also not going to be very helpful in predicting individual outcomes. So what's Johnny's collision velocity or Janie's collision velocity? For the average person, it's not going to have much effect. It's not going to be very predictively helpful for any other sort of individual outcome. Therefore, if knowing about the moon's location only improves the prediction about the average impact velocity by a small amount, 0.01%, our prediction about any specific impact velocity for a particular person has also basically not improved. Okay? Both for the average and for the outliers, we're not going to have much additional knowledge. Let me give a second example of this, and we're going to do a series of case studies for this. Anthrax and antibiotics. Okay, here's a question. Do people who inhale anthrax spores live longer if they're given Cipro, some sort of regimen of antibiotics, within 24 hours of an anthrax exposure? That is, if I treat you with antibiotics after you've inhaled anthrax, are you going to live longer than if you don't take the antibiotic? And I bet if we were to do this, here's a picture of an anthrax spore. They're remarkably small, thin little things that you can inhale. That's the thickness of a sheet of paper, and here's an anthrax spore series, and you can see exactly how many spores you could pack into a little small area. Now, assuming that I had anthrax spores inhaled, and the question is, are you going to live longer with or without the antibiotics? Here's what I think the curves would look like if you were to try to draw up these curves for people who live with or without antibiotics after being exposed to anthrax. The blue curve on the left is probably a mortality curve, or the likelihood of death on any given day between days 1 and 43 after being exposed to anthrax, right? Notice that by day 43, the curve ends. That is, anybody who has anthrax who's not been treated, this is the blue curve, no antibiotics, no one who is been treated with antibiotics is going to live past 43 days after the anthrax exposure, right? Some people start dying on day 1, then midway through there, 10, 15 days later, the most people are dying, but by day 43, no one's left alive. If you treated with antibiotics, my guess is you would get the red curve, which is people just are going to live just fine because they're going to overcome their anthrax and they'll live a normal life, anywhere between another year up to 50 years. And it's just going to be a normal life where the anthrax didn't affect them. In other words, is this causal relationship between antibiotics and your lifespan after being exposed to anthrax meaningful? Yes, there's a cause. Yes, taking antibiotics makes you live longer after you've gotten anthrax. But is it meaningful? Absolutely. In the first case of the blue curve, it's only up to 43 days you'll live. For the red curve, which is people who have been taking antibiotics after exposure, they'll live a normal life, which is far longer generally predicted than 43 days. It's measured in years instead. So the causal meaningfulness of these two curves is indeed significant. This is said in a different way here on this slide. Given knowledge whether someone took antibiotics after anthrax exposure, we can make a meaningful prediction about specific people. I can tell you about a specific person based only on the knowledge of whether they took antibiotics or not after the anthrax exposure, whether they will die within a few weeks of the anthrax exposure or not. So this intervention is meaningful, it's recommended, and it has a significant causal relationship. If changes in a known cause explain much of the variation in outcomes, it's also meaningful in predicting individual outcomes. And again, knowing whether a person has taken antibiotics within 24 hours of anthrax exposure vastly improves our ability to predict the longevity of that particular person. I want to turn to a third example here to try to solidify this. And this is a study where we're going to critique not only the aspects of the study, reaching back into our content that we've talked about prior on observational studies, but then also critiquing the causal meaningfulness of this study. So this is a study that comes from a very famous journal called Science, one of the most prestigious journals that scientists can publish in. It's a study published in 1980 by Benbow and Stanley, and they looked at gender and math ability among school students. This was a prospective longitudinal cohort study, the same sort of study design that Dahl and Hill used in looking at smoking, as was used also when we were looking at coffee and Parkinson's disease. A powerful observational study, not experimental, but observational. And so in this case, they found 9,927 seventh grade boys and girls who had been identified as mathematically gifted. They were in the top 2 to 5% of scores on standardized tests. Okay, so there were about 57% of these students were boys, about 43% were girls, and they were enrolled in the study of mathematically precocious youth. And as a result, they took the standard SAT exam, both the verbal and math score, which are normally given to graduating high school students in order to go into college, while they were still in 7th grade. And what the study results showed was there was no statistically significant difference in verbal scores between the boys and the girls in 7th grade who took the SAT test. However, one of the things that they noted in their study was that there was a strongly statistically significant difference in mathematical abilities among these students. More on that in a moment. The advantage of the study design, of course, is that researchers prior to these two scientists had hypothesized that segregated high school math tracks, advanced and regular math tracks in high school, created gender inequity. Boys went to the advanced math classes, girls stayed in the regular math classes, and as a result, girls were falling behind boys in standardized test performance at the end of high school. The nice thing about this study that Benbow and Stanley did, however, was the students, the 9,000 students who had been enrolled in their study, were all enrolled in identical math classes of all one level up until the point that the study began. So the criticism that, well, there's different tracks for boys and girls didn't apply to the students in their study, which allowed for an advantage over past studies where there was this differential in advanced and regular mathematics. And they found a quote, strongly statistically significant gender difference. Here's their language. A large sex difference in mathematical ability in favor of boys was observed in every talent search. The smallest mean difference in the 6 talent searches was 32 points on the SAT in 1979 in favor of boys for the mean. And the statistically significant t-tests of mean differences range from 2.5 to 11.6. In other words, the sort of statistical variation in what the actual mean score between boys and girls on the math portion of this test was ranged from 2.5 points all the way up to 11.6. And thus, on average, the boys scored better than girls, faring better at a standard deviation level. And even though all the students had been certified initially to be in the top 2, 3, or 5th percentiles of mathematical reasoning ability. So their conclusion for this, when they read all this through, was that it's notable that we observed a sizable sex difference in mathematical reasoning ability in 7th grade students. Okay. And they did admit, however, as they probably should in an observational study, we can't rule out other environmental explanations besides just an innate talent of boys at mathematics. And that is right? There's socialization issues, even within the same classes, although it was controlled for the fact that the students were all taking the same math classes. Internal to a given class, some students may have been given preferential treatment to others based on gender. So it's something that wasn't necessarily controlled for in this study. You don't actually know completely and causally that their conclusion is correct. They say in their own conclusion, we favor the hypothesis that sex differences in achievement in and attitude towards mathematics result from superior male mathematical ability, which may in turn be related to greater math ability in spatial tasks. This male superiority is probably an expression of a combination of both endogenous and exogenous variables. We recognize, however, that our data are consistent with numerous alternative hypotheses. Yeah, it's an observational study, and therefore it's not all necessarily causally controlled in the way an experimental study would be. Nonetheless, the hypothesis of differential course taking was not supported. In other words, we know that the fact that people take different courses is not why they're scoring differently on the math exam, and that probably is true as a result of this. It also seems likely that putting one's faith in boy versus girl socialization processes as the only permissible explanation of the sex difference in mathematics is premature. Okay, so their conclusion in this is boys score better than girls in 7th grade, even if they've taken the same math classes, and therefore we're going to ascribe this difference, since we've controlled for the fact that they're taking the same math class, to simple innate genetic gender differences in boys and girls. Okay. This, of course, created not just a little bit of controversy. And here's their data set. I'm just going to flash this on the screen really quickly. If you want to read these data, you can pause the slide and read their actual results here, where the highlighted portion I have on the screen is their mean scores of the SAT math section of the exam year by year between 1972 and 1979 when this study was conducted. Go ahead and read that and pause this for a moment if you want. Okay, and now given these statistics, here's what I want to show you is I've sort of construed a curve based on their numbers to show you, I think, what's going on here. So one curve of this is the SAT on the bottom horizontal axis is the SAT math score in 1978 as a representative year for their study. And then the frequency is on the vertical axis, how many of the students, what percentage of the boys or girls scored that certain specific score. I created a female curve in pink, a male curve in blue. And what you'll notice is that at both the median, which is the high point, the mean, I should say, the high point in each of these curves, for girls 413 was the score, and for boys 448, boys are ahead of girls by about 35 points in this study. It's also the case that where I've drawn the first standard deviations, one standard deviation in spread beyond the means, both at the high and low ends, boys are performing better than girls. 535 versus 484 at the high end, 361 versus 342 at the low end. As a result, what you can end up concluding is that at every level of the curve for boys is slightly shifted to the right for girls, and boys are outscoring girls at every level of the curve. This difference was not only there, but it was what's called strongly statistically significant in the author's points of view, based on their computations. And what that means is that we can sort of rule out chance, not even just at a 95% confidence level, but even at a 99% chance level, was this ruled out as being sort of a random result. They had statistically significant numbers of people enrolled in the study, 1,500 versus 1,200 in this particular example, so that it was fairly sure on their part that there was no chance at play here that had led to these results. But here's the point. If you look at the mean differential and I were trying to predict whether somebody is outperforming somebody else, and all I know is gender, the question is how much, based on the fact that I know it's a boy rather than a girl taking a test and nothing else about that test, how much better is the boy going to score than the girl on the test? And the answer is really only 9%. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that meaningful? Is this something we need to be all bent out of shape about one way or the other when we're talking about gender contributing only 9% of the variation in testing scores to SATs? And so when we're looking at this, we say there's a lot of other factors out there that lead to variation in why students perform differently on math tests besides gender. Gender is a relatively small component to why students perform better or worse on the SAT math exam. And so we might want to concentrate on other factors that are influencing test scores to try to move all test scores up rather than worrying specifically about gender as the causal factor of interest. My take on this, if I had to sort of summarize the study overall, the conclusion of the author's observational study, where they admitted that there is potential confounders, was that innate and environmental factors cause what I would say an unmeaningful difference between mathematically gifted boys and girls on their SAT math scores. My take on this is, first of all, I don't think that they successfully ruled out a number of different confounders that could have led to these results because of environmental factors, and they admit as much. But what the study did show, I think convincingly, is that the previously asserted hypothesis that differential tracks in high school of advanced and regular mathematics, where more boys go on the advanced track than girls, is not a cause of differences of SAT results. So we can rest assured that you're not somehow influencing the process by moving somebody ahead or behind in that. This was good at teasing out that effect. The conclusion I would say about all this, though, again, is the issue of meaningful causation we've talked about today. Who cares if gender inequity is due to innate factors or environmental factors, genetic factors, inborn, or some sort of cultural factor growing up? If the differences in the boys and the girls' math scores, even though they're statistically significant and not a matter of chance, they're not that meaningful. It's not that big a difference. And so why are we worrying about this as much as we are? And that's one example of meaningful causation today. In the next class, we'll cover one more example involving a health issue. I look forward to seeing your comments about this somewhat interesting and often controversial topic of meaningful causation.